this works. This is a sealed enclosure that was just in the freezer. And I took it out, put a balloon on top to show what happens when you warm it up rapidly. So I'm going to put it in this sink of warm water, simulate heating of the enclosure. You see bubbles are popping from the enclosure itself, which means the enclosure is not sealed. Therefore, when it cools down, the water around where that breach is, water is going to get sucked back into the enclosure. Ooh. You see the pressure's building.
Hi, I'm Nathan Oakley, and this is a response to Ranty Flat Earth's claim that you can't have gas pressure without a container. So, if I demonstrate it, it's dead easy. There's no balloon around that gas pressure, and there it is. There's no trick to it. There's no, special video equipment needed. You just film it, and you can show that gas pressure is easily maintainable without a container. So, I don't really know what you're talking about, Ranty Flat Earth, showing us that you have to have a tyre. It's just meaningless. I can easily demonstrate that you don't need the balloon to maintain the gas pressure. So there's your answer. You think you're clever with your tyre, but you're not. You can have gas pressure without a container, and I've shown it. So there you go. I've been Nathan Oakley, and I'll see you all in the next video.
Okay, as you can see, we're up in the mountains. We're 10,000 feet above sea level, and that means the air pressure is very low. So if you look at this packet of crisps, it's really inflated and feels a bit like a balloon. And that's because although there's the same amount of air inside the crisps, there's less air outside because we're so high up. So there's nothing pushing against the packet. So the packet's expanding, and when we get down to sea level, we should see a change in the crisps. That is, of course, unless it's burst, sending crisps all over us. So hopefully I'll be able to show you the crisps in a little while when we get down to the bottom. Here we are down the bottom of the mountain, and we've got the same packet of crisps unopened, and you can see that far less air inside, although actually the same amount of air inside, but because the air pressure is much higher down here, it's actually pushing against the packet. So you've got there a good demonstration of air pressure using crisps. I'm going to taste them to see if they're okay. Lovely.
Hello, atmospheric science students. This is Dr. John Schrage, and I am giving you a quick video here to talk to you about why moist air is less dense than dry air is. This is going to be done with using an equation that we call Avogadro's law, though we aren't actually going to see the equation here at all. We're doing this because we're talking about the definition of a front. Fronts are going to be that boundary that separates two air masses technically that have different densities. We don't normally think about it in terms of density in meteorology. Normally we kind of invoke the ideal gas law and we say that as long as these air masses are basically the same pressure, we can say that temperature and density are just related. Cold air is more dense, warm air is less dense. And so air masses with different temperatures typically have different densities, and so the boundary between them counts as up front. And this is the context in which we learned, say, about the polar fronts. Cold fronts, warm fronts, and stationary fronts are all boundaries that separate two air masses with different temperatures. The ones that aren't polar fronts, though, are occluded fronts and dry lines. These are types of fronts that are separating air masses that are not necessarily different temperatures. This video is not about occluded fronts. We're going to talk about dry lines. Dry lines are going to be separating air masses that are basically the same temperature, basically the same pressure, but not the same humidity. We know that dry lines are apparently a type of front, and by our definition of front, that means the air masses that are being separated have different densities. So let me tell you what we're about to see. We're going to end up seeing that at the same temperature and at the same pressure, humid air is going to turn out to be less dense, and dry air is going to turn out to be more dense. This is often backward as to what people are thinking. They always think it should be the other way around. And to understand why this is going to be, you're going to need to understand what Avogadro's law is. Avogadro's law, which turns out actually to be sort of an equivalent statement of the ideal gas law, tells us that two samples of gas that are the same volume, the same pressure, the same temperature, are going to contain the same number of molecules, quite regardless of what those molecules are. In particular, what those molecules weigh. Probably the best way for me to explain this to you is to just sort of do a little thought experiment here. Here are two jars. They're the same size. They have the same volume. And if we have, and we assume, let's say that these two jars are going to contain gas, and they're going to contain gas at the same temperature and the same pressure. So however many molecules are in the jar on the left, there's going to be exactly the same number of molecules in the jar on the right, as long as they are at the same temperature and the same pressure and have the same volume. It doesn't matter what those molecules are made of. I mean, right now, I'm showing them as being little pieces of clip art, and there's exactly the same number, but they're exactly the same stuff. But I could replace them with some heavier molecules. Here I'm drawing them using some little heavy weights there that say 1 ton on them. And it wouldn't change anything. There's still the same number of these molecules in the two jars, even if some of them are heavy like this. In the same sort of way, I could, on the jar on the right, I could replace some of those molecules with lighter molecules. Here I'm just sort of being silly about it and putting feathers in there. And in fact, these lighter molecules, again, if you add up the number of molecules in the jar on the left and the jar on the right, they're exactly the same. It doesn't matter that some of them are lighter. In fact, we could have the jar on the left have only heavy molecules, and we could have the jar on the right have only light molecules, and it wouldn't make a difference. Again, at the same pressure, at the same temperature, at the same volume, the two gases contain the same number of molecules. This, for example, is the basic story as to why helium balloons float. The helium balloon contains helium gas, which each individual molecule of helium is quite light. The helium balloon contains the same number of helium molecules that an air sample of the same size would contain of just air molecules, but since the air molecules are so much heavier and the helium molecules are so much lighter, that balloon has an overall weight that's less than the air around it, and therefore it floats. If we switch back to then looking at these two jars, let's forget about these kind of funny clip art molecules for a second here, and let's just fill these two jars with dry air at the same temperature and the same pressure. I tried to make this somewhat realistic by making some of the molecules nitrogen, N2, and some of them oxygen, O2. So I've got two jars here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the jar on the right, and I'm going to make this moist air following Avogadro's law. So I'm going to try to add water vapor. But I have to keep the same total number of molecules in here before this experiment as I had after it. So, for example, if I want to add some water vapor to the jar on the right, I have to get rid of some other molecules. Now, this is a little hard to explain how this would happen inside of a sealed jar. In the free atmosphere, this would involve the air expanding and stuff like that. But in just a simple little jar experiment, we're just going to have to think of it as we're going to replace a couple of these molecules, like nitrogen and oxygen, with water molecules, H2O. So now my jar on my right is moist air, and the jar on the left is completely dry air. Well, now let's actually get real information in here, and let's replace these nitrogen and oxygen and water molecules with their actual molecular weight. What do these molecules weigh? For example, nitrogen, N2, has a molecular weight of 28. The units aren't relevant to our current discussion or anything. So I could take all those little nitrogen molecules out and replace them with the number 28, and that is a measure of how much each of those molecules weigh. In the same sort of way, I could take these oxygen molecules out here and replace them with their molecular weight. O2 molecules have a molecular weight of about 32, so I could take those oxygen molecules out and replace them with the number 32. Finally, the molecular weight for water is 18. That surprises people. That's an awfully low number, but keep in mind it's H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. Hydrogens only weigh 1, the oxygen weighs 16, together they weigh 18. So let's replace the oxygen, the water molecules in here with the number 18. Well, now check out what's happened. The dry air jar on the left and the humid air on the right still contain the same number of molecules, but notice that the humid air molecules overall weigh less. That's because we have replaced a couple of heavy dry air molecules, like nitrogen and oxygen, with light water vapor molecules. Overall, for the whole jar, the weight of the air, or the mass of the air inside of the jar, has gone down once we have made the air humid. So our core message here is that the dry air is going to be more dense than the humid air, assuming we're talking approximately the same temperature and approximately the same pressure. Now, that has a really important meteorological implication when we think about what is going to happen along a dry line. In the United States, we typically get dry lines in the south central U.S., down by like Texas and Oklahoma. If we look at a map of the U.S., in that part of the world, we do have good sources of dry and moist air. We have a nice source region for continental tropical air masses. That would be our continental, dry, tropical, warm air masses. That would be like the deserts of Mexico and New Mexico, maybe West Texas, etc. And if we take a look at the geography of the region, we see that we also have an excellent source region for warm, moist air masses, maritime tropical, or MT air masses. That's, of course, the Gulf of Mexico. Air masses that form over the Gulf of Mexico are going to be warm and moist, and these two locations are right next to each other. There's going to be a boundary between these air masses as they move, which I'm drawing here as this line, and this line is going to be an example of a dry line. The dry line is a boundary that separates dry air masses from moist air masses when they're at basically the same temperature and pressure. But we know that the two air masses are not the same density. The dry air mass is relatively heavy, the moist air mass is relatively light. That has an important implication if we try to draw ourselves a little cross-section across the front. Here I've made myself a little PowerPoint illustrated cross-section here. I'm trying to show that it's west to the left and east to the right in this PowerPoint. And you can see that because it's heavier, that CT air mass, the continental tropical one, is heavy and dense, and it is wedging its way under the maritime tropical air mass, that moist light air. That means that because that air mass, that dry air mass is so much heavier, it can go under the maritime tropical air mass, which rises to get out of its way. Well, lifting warm, moist air sounds like a recipe for thunderstorms to me. That sounds almost ideal, actually, for making a good thunderstorm. I mean, you're lifting warm, moist air. Sounds like it's going to have lots of energy available for lifting. Now, it turns out there's other reasons as well why dry lines turn out to be favorable for thunderstorms, but in particular, they're favorable for tornadic thunderstorms. The kind of lifting and the dynamics that are involved in dry lines turn out to be perfect for the development of tornadic thunderstorms. And if we take a look at a map again as to like where we're looking at on this map, as to where all these dry lines are happening, that's the part of the country we call Tornado Alley. It's a part of the country where it is particularly favorable. We know that there are lots of tornadoes in places like Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and so on. It's because they get a relatively large number of dry lines. Okay, I hope this little quick tour of why moist air masses are less dense than dry air masses has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. This has been Dr. John Schrage, copyright 2012.
Artlist.io.
Hello everyone. Today I'd like to start by dropping this deck of cards on the floor. If I left the room right now and came back a decade later, the pile would still be disordered on the floor. It would not have gone back to the stacked deck. Why? The second law of thermodynamics, established with ample experimental evidence, governs the change in a closed system over time. It states that within such systems, the degree of disorder, also known as the entropy, will always increase. Another way to state the second law is that the entropy of the universe increases in the course of any spontaneous change. Of course, in thermodynamics, the universe is comprised of the system and its surroundings. Because of the second law, a gas will expand to fill the void. Gas atoms do not spontaneously gather in a corner of a room. The always increasing disorder occurs because of the tiny amounts of heat which is slowly exchanged with the surroundings. We can represent this tiny amount of heat as delta Q, where Q represents heat. The equation for the second law states that in a closed system, the change in the entropy represented by ds must always be greater than the tiny amount of heat divided by the temperature at which the transfer of heat is taking place. This applies to all processes which are considered irreversible. In fact, this applies to all real processes, since fully reversible processes are strictly theoretical in nature. A Frenchman known as Sadi Carnot studied the requirements to do work in what is known today as the Carnot heat engine. This led to another thinking about the second law of thermodynamics. Let's go over the basics of his ideas, which essentially involved building a heat engine which could do work. Carnot recognized three aspects of every engine. First, they must have a high temperature source of heat. Second, they must convert that heat into work, like the piston we built when discussing the first law. And third, they must have access to a heat sink. That is, there must be some part of the surroundings which have a lower temperature. If you were an engineer, you would care about the efficiency of the engine you designed. Efficiency E can be defined as the ratio of the work produced, W, related to the total heat absorbed, Q. If all the heat in a system could be converted into work, the efficiency would be 1. A typical gasoline engine has an efficiency of only about 25 to 50%. Even the best engines have much lower efficiencies than 1. Sadi Carnot made an amazing discovery about heat engine efficiency. He found that efficiency was related only to the temperature of the heat source and the sink. The efficiency of an engine is equal to 1 minus the temperature of the sink divided by the temperature of the heat source. That was a truly remarkable finding. The key to an efficient engine is not solely in the temperature of the heat source, but more importantly, in the temperature of the sink. If you could run your engine with a heat sink that remained at absolute zero, you could have perfect efficiency. In any case, if your engine could run with a very cold heat sink, it could be much more efficient. Carnot's work implied something else. If the surroundings of an engine did not exist, the engine would stop. At least some of the heat energy must be lost to the surroundings, and this becomes a statement of the second law. No cyclic process is possible in which heat is taken from a hot source and converted completely into work. This statement was first proposed by William Thomson, and this heat loss is why processes are never fully reversible.
Artlist